This lake house is perfect for Victoria, my father declared during what was supposed to be an informal family dinner, his voice sounding with that familiar intonation of fake nonchalance that always preceded his worst decisions. In fact, I've already transferred it to her name. She deserves a nice summer home. I gripped my fork in my fingers, carefully studying the smug expression on my father's face and the triumphant smile of Victoria, who turned 32, exactly 4 years younger than me. I spent years watching my father give his new wife things that didn't belong to him, but this time it was different. I was ready. Actually. I kept my voice steady, calm, without a single hint of anger. Years of practice had taught me to hide steel under the silk of words. I wonder if you should check these notes again, Dad. My name is Olivia Bennett, and this lake house meant everything to me. My grandmother left it to me when she passed away 5 years ago, her last gift to her granddaughter, who helped her take care of her beloved garden every summer, paint shutters and restore the old wooden pier where we had morning tea. This property has been in our family for generations, and every room holds memories of lazy summer days, cozy winter retreats by the fireplace, Christmas dinners filled with laughter, and that special silence that only happens in places where you're truly loved. Victoria, my father's wife, who lived with him for 3 years, has been eyeing this house since the day she first saw it at 28. She married my father with a calculated precision that would have been admirable if it hadn't been so obvious. My father, who was still recovering from his mother's death and desperately wanted to feel young again, completely succumbed to her charms, convinced that it was love, and not a thirst for stability and comfort, that motivated his new chosen one. What do you mean, check the records? Victoria's voice cut sharply through my thoughts, and I noticed how her fingers tightened on the stem of the glass. She always felt the moment when things didn't start going the way she wanted them to. I reached for my phone and opened the email I received this morning. The lake house can't be registered in your name, Victoria, I said calmly, looking her straight in the eye, because it's been placed in an irrevocable trust since 8 o'clock this morning. My father's face darkened, confusion flashed in his eyes, and I was curious if he really didn't know about it or if he just hoped that I would never dare to stand in his way. What are you talking about? His voice sounded strained, and there was that hoarseness in it that always betrayed his irritation. The document was clear, the property passed to me, and I have a power of attorney. I did the translation myself, and you. I smiled, running my finger over the smooth surface of the table, enjoying this moment. Maybe you should take another look at the original was submitted to your grandmother's lawyer, rather than the copy you had in your office. 6 months ago, I received a call from Mr. Sullivan, my grandmother's longtime friend and trusted lawyer. He was concerned about some of the inquiries made about the ownership of the property. Your father was asking questions, he warned me. Questions that made him think he was planning something. It was then that I learned about my grandmother's true gift, not only the house by the lake, but also the legal protection she provided to keep it safe. This is ridiculous, Victoria snapped a perfect manicure, tapping her glass angrily, and I didn't need to see her shoulders tense to know she was furious. James, tell her it's funny. Victoria snapped, turning to my father, but he barely heard her. His gaze was fixed on my phone screen, on the very trust documents that left no room for ambiguity or maneuver. I watched as his face paled by the second, as the thin veil of self-confidence slowly slipped away, leaving only confusion and anger. The documents were very clear. Any unauthorized attempt to transfer the property or change its status in any way would have immediate legal consequences. I saw how his fingers were clenching into a fist, how his chest was heaving unevenly, and I even felt a little sorry for him, not because he was at a dead end, but because he really believed that he could so easily circumvent the precautions provided by my grandmother. You can't do this, he finally managed, his voice sounding hoarse and staccato, as if the words were stuck in his throat. I'm your father, and this was your grandmother's house. I looked at him calmly, even gently, but there was a cold anger boiling inside me, the same one that had been accumulating for years, that was woven from disappointment, betrayal, and fatigue from the endless struggle for what was rightfully mine. She left it to me for some reason, I said, not raising my voice, but making it clear that I wasn't going to back down. Do you really think she wouldn't have protected him? Victoria jumped up abruptly. Her chair skidded across the floor with a nasty screech, and in that second I could almost see her carefully laid plans crumbling. You're ungrateful, she began, but I interrupted her with the same gentle confidence that I inherited from my grandmother. Be a little more careful with your expressions, I said, leaning back in my chair. The trust has very specific provisions on harassment or interference, and as far as I know, Mr. Sullivan is very meticulous in his documentation. The silence that followed was deafening. My father looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes, while Victoria, who had been so confident until recently, now stood in the middle of the room, clenching her fists, her perfect composure crumbling like a house of cards in a gust of wind. But we have already planned everything, she whispered to herself, not even realizing she was speaking out loud. Contractors should start work next week. I took a slow sip of water, letting the moment drag on, before calmly saying, You will have to cancel them. Any changes in ownership require the written permission of the trust manager, and I am the trust manager. My father opened his mouth, probably intending to try a different angle of attack, but I raised my hand, stopping him before he could speak. And that's not all, I added, feeling the tension in the room reach its limit. The trust includes detailed records of every attempt to access or transfer property over the past 6 months, including several very interesting conversations with real estate agents about potential buyers that attracted their attention. I took my time, letting these words sink in the minds of those present. Victoria's face changed from an angry red to deathly pale in a matter of seconds, while my father seemed to sink even deeper into his chair, as if he was crushed by the weight of realization. Have you tried to sell it? I asked, even though I knew the answer perfectly well. Mr. Sullivan's investigation was thorough, even before this transfer to Victoria had time to take effect. He informed me not only about the strange questions my father had asked, but also about how negotiations with interested buyers were conducted, how the market value of the house was checked, and how plans for its resale were being developed. We were just considering options. Victoria tried to step back, but her voice lacked the confidence she was used to speaking with. Options, I repeated, bowing my head slightly. Do you know the value of real estate in this area? She nodded, clutching at the thought like it was a lifeline. Exactly, she said quickly, the market is incredibly profitable right now, and we. That's why, I interrupted, leaning closer. The trust includes a provision prohibiting any sale without the unanimous consent of all beneficiaries. I paused, enjoying the moment when her face contorted with understanding. And since I am the only beneficiary, the consequences hung in the air. Not only had their attempt to transfer the property failed, but their broader plans to make a profit by selling the house were now impossible. I saw Victoria's lips turn white, as her nails dug into her palms, as her perfect mask cracked, and now in front of me stood a woman who had been robbed of the last thing she considered her victory. My father finally found his voice, but now there was an uncertainty in it that I had never encountered before. You don't understand, Olivia. He began, but his words sounded tired, as if he knew it wouldn't change anything. Victoria and I, we had plans. The sale would give us capital, and we could. What? I raised an eyebrow. Finance another of her business ventures? Like, for example, that boutique that mysteriously closed after 6 months? Or maybe that yoga studio that never opened? Victoria's face was contorted with anger, and now she looked like she was ready to throw herself at me. How dare you? She screamed, and her voice was full of pure rage. James, are you going to let her talk to me like that? But my father was still looking at the trust documents, his fingers barely trembling, and his jaw was clenched tightly, as if he was trying to find a loophole, some kind of flaw, at least something that would give him a chance to challenge the inevitable. I saw how his mind, accustomed to power and control, refused to accept reality. He had lost not only the house by the lake, but also the potential profit that he and Victoria had counted on, building their cunning plans. I stood up calmly, gathering my things, taking my time, but also not giving a single chance to object. "I'm the trust administrator," I reminded him, directing a look at my father in which there was neither gloating nor triumph, only calm confidence. "We will be conducting an inspection of the property next weekend. I need you to pick up all the personal items you left there. After that, the security codes will be changed." "You can't just," Victoria began, but I cut her off before she could finish her sentence. "I can, and I will." I paused before adding with gentle but unshakable firmness, "Grandma made sure to anticipate such situations." I noticed Victoria biting her lip, and my father looked down. They both knew that everything had already been decided, and they no longer had any options. "You know," I continued, "she told Mr. Sullivan that my father would eventually try something like this, which is why she created the trust in this way." I turned around, heading for the exit, but when I reached the door, I stopped, allowing the finishing touch to fall on this canvas of defeat. "Oh, Dad," I added, as if remembering something minor but extremely important. "You might want to check your email. Mr. Sullivan has sent you some interesting documents regarding your use of the power of attorney. He believes that there may be some violations that are worth discussing." I didn't wait for their reaction. I didn't need to see their expressions slowly change from annoyance to realization and finally to panic. I'll remember this moment for a long time, but not for revenge. I didn't need it. It was an act of protection. I was protecting what was rightfully mine, what my grandmother entrusted to me, and now, thanks to her foresight, this house will remain exactly where it belongs, in the hands of someone who truly appreciates its value. When I was driving home that evening, soft music was playing in the car, and familiar landscapes stretched outside the window, but my thoughts were far away. I remembered all the summer days I spent in that house by the lake, when my grandmother night tended her garden, painted the shutters, renovated the furniture, and in the evenings we sat on the old pier, chatting about life and watching the sunset. She taught me a lot, but the most important lesson was not how to grow roses or fix a creaky floor, but how to stand up for yourself, how to protect what matters. "Olivia," she told me one day, as the sun sank below the horizon, turning the water in shades of gold and copper, "the best defense is to be prepared. People will always try to take away what doesn't belong to them, but they can only succeed if you let them." She was right, as always, and now, thanks to her foresight, the lake house was safe. He will remain a part of our family, a part of me. My phone vibrated, startling me out of my thoughts. I looked at the screen, a message from Mr. Sullivan. "Everything is going according to plan." I smiled, typing a quick reply. Exactly the way Grandma would like it. The next morning, my phone was inundated with messages, and each one reflected the chaos I'd left behind after last night. Angry, almost hysterical messages from Victoria, pleading voicemails from my father, and even a few confused requests from family friends who were apparently promised to use the lake house for their summer vacations. I forwarded each message to Mr. Sullivan, adding details of their behavior to his already impressive documentation. I knew that this was far from the end, that they would try to find loopholes, that Victoria, who was not used to losing, would not give up so easily, but it no longer mattered. "They're getting desperate," Mr. Sullivan remarked during our morning call. "Your father just tried to make an emergency appointment for me. Did he claim that there must be some mistake in the trust documents?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "Exactly," the lawyer smiled dryly. "But your grandmother didn't make mistakes, Olivia, especially when it came to protecting what was important to her." Later that day, I headed to the lake house, feeling vaguely uneasy and wanting to see with my own eyes what changes they had already made before I officially took full possession of the property. I expected the worst, but when my car turned into the familiar gravel driveway, my heart sank painfully from what I saw. Part of the garden, which my grandmother had lovingly tended for decades, was ruthlessly dug out, The rose bushes that she had grown with such care were gone, and in their place were dark patches of plowed earth, as if the wounds on the body of this house. Obviously, this was part of the very immodernization that Victoria talked about so confidently, building her castles in the air and anticipating the moment when she could call this place her own. Construction materials that had been brought in anticipation of the planned work were piled up near the pier, and a huge dumpster was filled to the brim with things that seemed vaguely familiar to me. I came closer and felt anger boil up in me. Among the construction junk, I noticed my grandmother's old kitchen utensils, her carved wooden shells that always hung in the kitchen, and even the old wicker chair where she liked to sit sipping her morning tea. I took out my phone and started photographing the damage, recording every detail, knowing that these pictures might be needed for the proceedings. I had just finished another shot when I heard the sound of an engine. A car drove down the driveway, and when it stopped, Victoria almost flew out of it, looking less polished than usual, her hair disheveled, anger mixed with intense anxiety on her face. She walked toward me with quick steps, balancing on her misplaced heels, and her gaze darted between my phone and the ruined garden, as if she realized that not everything was going according to her script. "You have no right to be here," she snapped, her eyes flashing angrily, but I just looked at her with unflappable calm. "Actually, you have no right to be here." I put down my phone, making sure that the photos had already been uploaded to the cloud storage. As of this morning, the security company has been instructed to treat any unauthorized entry into the territory as an illegal intrusion. Victoria laughed, but there was no confidence in that laugh, rather a hysterical tinge of growing panic. "I'm James's wife. This is our summer home." "No," I took a step closer, pronouncing the words calmly, but with that unconditional firmness that leaves no room for argument. "This is my property, which is in a trust established by my grandmother. And the contractors you hired have already been notified that any work done without proper authorization will result in prosecution." Victoria's face contorted with rage. She clenched her fists, as if she could hardly restrain herself from shouting at me right here, in the middle of this mutilated earth. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" "Stop it," she hissed, her eyes flashing. "But you have no idea what you're doing. James and I had buyers, people who were willing to pay a lot of money for this house. It could suit all of us." "All of us?" I grinned, tilting my head. "You mean to set you up? Just like you thought that marrying my father would set you up?" Her face flushed with anger, and she took a step toward me, pointing an accusing finger, but I didn't even move. "Everything was fine until you intervened." Her voice trembled, and she was seething with indignation. "We had plans for this place, plans that would benefit everyone." "Everyone but me," I said flatly. "Everyone except my grandmother, who wanted to preserve this place, not demolish it and turn it into someone else's commercial project." "Your grandmother is dead." Victoria spat out angrily, and her words were like a punch in the chest. "And you're living in the past, clinging to this old house as if it were some kind of shrine." I took a deep breath, keeping my composure even though everything inside me was boiling with rage. "You're right about one thing," I said, crossing my arms over my chest. "I'm saving this place. But not only because of the past, but because of what it is, because it can still be." At that moment, another car turned into the driveway, and I recognized it immediately. My father. He slowly got out of the car, looking older and more depressed than I'd ever seen him. His shoulders hunched, his eyes lacked the confidence with which he was used to looking at me, and I realized that the conversation with Mr. Sullivan had borne fruit. "Victoria," he called, his voice sounding tired. She whirled on him, her eyes blazing with anger. "You said you could handle it." "Stop it," she screamed. "You said that the power of attorney—" "I was wrong," he interrupted quietly but firmly, and for the first time I heard real regret in his voice. "About a lot of things." I watched their exchange with a strange sense of detachment, realizing that for the first time in a long time, I no longer had to fight for my place. It was a moment when my father had to make a choice that involved much more than just a matter of ownership, between his new wife's desire for quick money and the desire to save something more for the family than another lucrative deal, between other people's plans and the family legacy, between what can be sold and something that should stay forever. I saw how his face froze, how he pressed his lips together, as if there was a struggle going on inside him, and how Victoria, who was standing next to him, also realized that there would be no place for her in this choice. "Contractors," she reminded, unable to hide the tension in her voice. "We have already made deposits. Contracts have been signed. Materials have been purchased." But my father had already shaken his head, his haggard face looking as if he had just suffered not just a financial setback, but something much more personal. "We'll have to confiscate the deposit," he said dully, not looking at Victoria. "We had no right to allow these changes. The trust makes this very clear." Victoria's face seemed frozen in a strange combination of emotions, first anger, then disbelief, then intense calculation, and finally icy rage. She didn't say another word, just turned on her heel and walked briskly to her car, got behind the wheel, turned sharply, sending dust from the gravel road into the air, and disappeared around the bend, leaving my father and me standing among the ruined garden and watching the clouds of gray smoke dissipate. "I'm sorry," my father finally broke the silence, and I heard not just regret in his voice, but real pain. He looked at the dilapidated garden, and there was bitterness in his eyes. "Your grandmother loved this place so much. She loved it." "Yes," I nodded, clenching my fingers into a fist to contain my emotions. "And she trusted me to protect him. Not just the house, Dad, but everything it stands for. The memories, the story, the future she represented for our family." My father slowly turned his gaze to me, and a shadow of something like understanding flashed in his eyes. "I forgot," he muttered, running a hand over his face. "Somewhere along the way, I got carried away with Victoria's ideas about luxury, repairs, deals. I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought I could make up for something." He didn't finish, but I knew what he wanted to say. About his weakness, that after his mother's death, he sought salvation in anything rather than face the emptiness inside himself. "Your mother," he paused, as if gathering his thoughts, and then added dully, "she would be disappointed in me." The air between us suddenly felt heavy, filled with things that had been accumulating for years, innuendos, disappointment, pain that neither of us wanted to admit. "She loved this place too," I said, looking at the house, at the uprooted bushes, at the mangled earth. "She supported my grandmother's decision to leave it to me." My father nodded. "It's not too late," I finally said, looking directly at him. "The garden can be transplanted. Those things that are in the dumpster can be saved. It will take time, but it will be worth it." He looked at me for a long time, as if for the first time in a long time he really saw not just his daughter, but the man who fought for this house, as my grandmother once fought for it. "This is..." He exhaled slowly. "That's exactly what your grandmother always said." I looked at him and suddenly I saw not only a man who made mistakes, but also the man who once taught me how to fish from the pier, who helped build sand castles on the shore, who told me stories when I was afraid to fall asleep during a thunderstorm. "You can help," I said quietly. "If you want to." My father looked at me, and I saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes, but also hesitation. "Trust exists to protect property," I said carefully. "But this does not mean that it should break up families. A real family is people who understand what this place means." My father looked around, at the garden, at the house, at the sparkling lake behind the trees. "Victoria won't like this," he muttered, but I could see that his words no longer had the confidence with which he always followed her. "Then Victoria will have to make a choice," I shrugged. "Just like you did it now." We were standing among the rubble of my grandmother's garden, and I suddenly realized that sometimes saving a place means not only protecting it legally, but also giving those who have forgotten its value a chance to remember what is really important. Choose a legacy instead of benefits, a family instead of empty promises. The father sighed, bent down, and picked up the discarded gardening tool. Where should we start? I smiled, remembering all the summer days I spent with my grandmother in this very garden, how she taught me how to take care of plants, how she told me that handwork helps to clear my mind, how she repeated the same instruction when we started any business. It's best to start where you're standing, I said, repeating her words. And so we started. Work to restore the garden, to restore the house to its former appearance, and perhaps something much more important. I knew it wasn't going to be easy ahead. Victoria won't give up so easily. Her influence still hangs over my father like a shadow, and trust, once undermined, takes time to regain it. But when I was working next to him, clearing the ground of debris, I could almost hear my grandmother's voice in the soft rustle of the wind, in the breathing of the trees, in the splash of water at the pier. Sometimes, Olivia, the biggest victories are not the battles you win, but what you decide to build afterward. Over the next few weeks, the true scale of the changes Victoria and my father planned to make to the lake house became painfully clear, and the deeper I delved into this story, the more I was overcome with rage mixed with shock. As I sorted through the papers in my father's home office, trying to figure out how far their intentions had gone, more and more details popped up in front of me, turning disturbing conjectures into tangible reality. Among the documents, I found detailed architectural plans, according to which our house was supposed to turn into a modern luxury resort, designed for 50 guests, with wide glass facades, high-tech rooms, conference rooms, and a spa complex. The contractor's accounts told an even more frightening story. They were hired to start work without the necessary permits, acting quickly to make changes before anyone could step in and block the process. The more I studied these documents, the more clearly Victoria's influence emerged. Her clear, almost soulless calculation aimed only at maximizing future profits, without a single thought about the family history of this place, its significance for us, or its true value. One evening, as I was reviewing another batch of papers with Mr. Sullivan via video link, trying to grasp the full extent of the potential destruction, my father knocked on my office door. He looked depressed, indecisive, and in his hand I noticed a thick envelope stamped Manala Investments, a large consulting company specializing in real estate. "There's something else you need to see," he said softly, placing the envelope on my desk. I opened it and pulled out the contents. Among the papers were marketing materials for Lake Victoria Resort and Spa, a presentation of the future luxury resort, with beautiful digital renderings and slogans designed to attract potential investors. And in these pictures, among immaculate lawns, heated pools, and perfectly trimmed bushes, I saw him, our house, completely rebuilt, changed beyond recognition, demolished and rebuilt, without a soul, without a history, without everything that made it special. My grandmother's garden is gone, replaced by a huge parking lot. The wooden pier that she restored with her own hands every summer, from which I once jumped into the water, has disappeared, replaced by a modern marina for private yachts. She had investors lined up, the father confessed, his voice sounding hollow, as if it was difficult for him to pronounce the words himself. That's why she was so confident that the transfer of ownership would go smoothly. They were ready to start construction as soon as the papers officially changed hands. I felt physically ill, and I felt a wave of indignation wash over me, and my hands began to shake as I flipped through the glossy pages filled with false promises of profitability, prosperity, and investment. "And you agreed to this?" I finally asked, looking up from the documents and glaring at my father. He sat down heavily in the chair opposite, as if he was tired of himself. She made it sound so reasonable," he muttered, rubbing his face with his hands. "She said that we were acting stupidly by leaving such valuable property unused for most of the year. She called it unlocking potential, an unused resource." I couldn't keep the sarcastic note out of my voice. "Dad, I'm using this house. I care about him. I share it with my family and friends. And just because we don't charge $500 a night from the guests doesn't mean it's been idle. Before he could answer, my phone vibrated. I looked at the screen and saw a message from Victoria. Your precious lake house will not remain yours forever. Everyone has a price. I silently forwarded the message to my father, watching his face fall as he read it. She's been like this ever since you revealed the terms of the trust, he finally said, his voice sounding lost. Angry, calculating. This is not the woman I married. Or maybe it's her, I suggested softly. And you finally saw it. The next morning, Mr. Sullivan called me with news that only confirmed my suspicions. My investigation has revealed a pattern, Olivia. His voice was strained but professionally controlled. Victoria has used similar schemes before. I gripped the phone, anticipating the worst. Unsuccessful resort projects, he continued, inflated expectations of investors who ended up with nothing, missing investments, projects that collapsed under very suspicious circumstances. She's done this more than once. I swallowed hard. How? She found rich older men, gained their trust, gained access to their assets, and then used their connections and finances for her real estate ventures. Mr. Sullivan paused before adding, when things went bad, she just disappeared. I felt my stomach tighten. You mean? Your father is not the first, Olivia, he confirmed, and, I'm afraid, if he had signed the transfer of property, he would have become her next victim. I thought about sharing this information with my father, but in the end I decided against it. He was already struggling with the realization of Victoria's true nature, with shattered illusions, with a sense of guilt for his blindness, and another exposure, another proof that he was not the first in a long line of her victims, could finally break him. Instead, I decided to focus on what could be healed, on what could still be saved. The garden was slowly coming back to life. My father and I came here every week, replanting what had been uprooted, taking care of what could still be saved, and restoring the house to its former appearance. We worked in silence, but this silence was not oppressive, not the kind that arises between strangers, but filled with a common understanding, a common goal. I saw how my father gradually changed, how his hands, accustomed to papers and documents, got used to the ground again, how his posture became a little less tense, how he looked at this place with warmth, and not with cold calculation. One Saturday morning, when we were clearing the flower beds of weeds, Victoria made her last attempt. She drove up in her sleek black SUV, and before I could straighten up, two men in expensive suits got out of the car, escorting her like a personal retinue. Victoria walked across the lawn with her head held high. Her steps were confident, but there was no longer the same triumphant self-confidence in her eyes, rather a desperate desire to hold at least the remnants of power. These gentlemen represent my investors, she announced, stopping in front of us, her voice steady, but I could see the tension in every word. They are ready to make you a very generous offer for the property. I calmly wiped my hands on a towel, put the gardening tools aside and, meeting her gaze, said without the slightest hesitation, "The house is not for sale. At no price." The taller of the two men stepped forward, handing me a business card with the embossed logo of an investment company. "Perhaps we could discuss this inside?" he offered with a smile he had learned over the years of negotiations. "Our offer may surprise you." "No," I replied firmly, without even looking at the card. "The trust prohibits any sale. This is non-negotiable." Victoria's polished facade cracked. "You stupid sentimental fool." Her voice was shaking with rage. "Do you have any idea how much money you're throwing away by stubbornly clinging to some old woman's damn garden?" I felt anger rising inside me, but before I could say anything, my father, who had been working silently nearby all this time, raised his head and calmly said, "This old woman was my mother, Victoria. And this garden, this house, is her legacy. Not your next investment, not your way to make money, not your resale of real estate." I saw Victoria tense up, her back straightened, but she clearly didn't expect him to say those words. "James," her voice became softer, almost pleading. Be reasonable. Think about our future. He turned to face her, and there was a calmness in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. I'm just thinking about the future, Victoria. And it seems to me that it's moving in a completely different direction than you are. The men, sensing the shift in dynamics, began slowly backing away to the car, clearly realizing that the deal they had hoped for was crumbling before their eyes. Victoria watched them go, her carefully laid plans crumbling, and I saw real fear flash in her eyes, fear not of losing money, but of realizing that her influence on my father was disappearing. It's not over yet, she hissed, turning to me, but her words sounded empty. Actually, it's over, I said calmly, pulling my phone out of my pocket. Mr. Sullivan has been very thorough in documenting your history of real estate fraud. He's ready to share his findings with the relevant authorities if you continue to harass us. Victoria froze for a second, as if deciding whether to go all in or retreat. But her face paled, she gave us one last angry look, turned around and walked briskly to her car. Soon, tires screeched, gravel flew into the air, and she disappeared around a bend, leaving my father and me standing in the middle of a half-restored garden. We were silent for a while, digesting everything that had just happened. Then, after a long pause, the father exhaled slowly. I was such a fool, he finally said, shaking his head. No, I corrected quietly, looking up at him. You were just a man who wanted to believe in love again. There's nothing wrong with that. He looked at me, and then looked around, as if realizing for the first time exactly what we had done, what we had saved. Your grandmother would be proud of you, you know. His voice was soft. Not just for protecting the house, but for the way you did it. With strength, but also with dignity. I smiled and picked up my gardening tools, going back to work. She'd be proud of you too, Dad, I said, not looking at him, but knowing he would hear. For finding your way back. We continued to work side by side as the sun slowly sank towards the horizon. I thought about everything that had happened, about how Victoria had tried to turn this place filled with memories and meaning into another soulless resort, about how she had almost managed to achieve her goal, not by brute force, but by manipulation, false promises, and skillful play on weaknesses. But my grandmother saw it coming. She knew that the true value of the lake house lay not in its market value, not in the possibility of making it part of some business, but in the generations of memories it held and those that had yet to be created. What is happening now? What is it? My father asked, straightening up and running his hand over his forehead as we finished planting a row of my grandmother's favorite roses, their delicate petals almost glowing in the warm evening light. I looked at the lake. Its surface was golden, reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. The water was calm, as if frozen in the moment, and in this reflection I saw not just a familiar landscape, but something more, a restored balance, albeit fragile, but real. Now we're restoring more than just the garden, I said, making it clear that it wasn't just about flower beds and flowers. My father nodded, understanding me without further explanation. We both knew that property trust management, like gardens, requires time, attention, and care to become strong again, and standing here surrounded by evidence of new growth breaking through old roots, I realized that we were moving in the right direction. Victoria's grandiose dreams of the Lake Victoria Resort and Spa have remained nothing more than glossy images in a forgotten folder, and the real house by the lake, my grandmother's house, a place steeped in memories and family history, will remain exactly what it has always been, a refuge, a space where the family can heal, become hold on tight and move forward. Weeks passed, and along with the flowers in the garden, something new appeared, a strange but correct rhythm of life in a house that once seemed lost to me. What started as my solo mission to protect my grandmother's legacy turned into something unexpected, a chance to restore not only the property itself, but also my relationship with my father. Every morning we came here with coffee, discussed plans for the day, worked step by step on the restoration, and I began to notice that he remembers much more than I thought. She always planted lavender on the east side, he said one day when we were marking out a new section of the garden. And hydrangeas grow better in the shade than you might think. I looked at him, amazed, realizing that even when it seemed to me that he was moving away from us, when his thoughts were immersed in business and worries, he still noticed. He remembered, and it meant more than I could put into words. Victoria, meanwhile, kept her distance, but not her silence. Her lawyers sent more and more desperate offers over and over again, trying to circumvent the terms of the trust, inventing new legal loopholes, insisting on compensation, negotiations, and concessions, but I remained firm. "She's running out of options," Mr. Sullivan explained during one of our weekly calls. "The investors to whom she promised this property are demanding answers, and as far as I can tell, she has already made serious financial commitments, hoping to receive this house." I watched through the window as my father, leaning over the old pier, carefully replaced the damaged boards, and said, without even taking my eyes off him, "That's not my problem." "No," the lawyer agreed after a short pause. "But you have to be prepared for escalation. People like Victoria rarely accept defeat with dignity." And he was right. A week later, Victoria made her last attempt, turning not to me, but to my father. I noticed them through the kitchen window. She was standing at the edge of the plot. Her movements were sharp, tense. Her gesture spoke of a mixture of emotions, from pleading to threats, and he, with his arms crossed over his chest, listened, but did not answer, only slowly shook his head. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see Victoria losing her composure more and more, her carefully controlled appearance beginning to crumble, despair breaking through her mask, and finally my father saying something that made her shoulders tense and then slump. After a few minutes, she turned around and left. The father stood in place for a while longer, then, taking a deep breath, headed back into the house. I met him at the door, and I could tell by the look on his face that Victoria had reached the last line. "She wanted me to challenge the trust," he said without preamble. I tensed up. "She said that if I stated that your grandmother was not in her right mind when she drafted the documents, we might have a chance to invalidate it." I felt a chill run down my spine, despite the warm summer air, despite the evening sun casting long shadows. "And what did you say?" He sank into a chair, his shoulders seeming to grow heavier. "I told her it was over." I noticed how his fingers curled into a fist as he ran his hand over his face, as if trying to erase the last traces of a past that he could no longer change. The severity of his decision was evident in every line of his face. But despite his fatigue, there was something new in his eyes. Awareness. Liberation. And maybe, finally, peace. I filed for divorce. These words hung in the air between us, heavy, meaningful, carrying something more than just the legal process of breaking up a marriage. It was a recognition, an awareness, a release. I looked at my father, expecting to hear doubt or at least a note of regret in his voice, but his face remained calm, and in that calmness I saw something new, a determination he hadn't had before. "It wasn't what I expected," I finally said, choosing my words. "And not what I wanted when it all started. When I first stood up for the lake house, I didn't think it would lead to the destruction of his marriage, that it would open wounds that I hadn't even realized existed, that it would put mirrors in front of my father in which he would see the things he was running from." "Dad." I started, but he interrupted me, his voice firm but not harsh. "It's not your fault, Olivia." I met his eyes. "Victoria and I." He exhaled, as if admitting the truth not only to me, but also to himself. What we had wasn't real. Not from her side anyway. I was nothing more to her than a means to an end, access to property, connections, and the opportunity to pull off another scam. I nodded, feeling that now was finally the time to tell him the truth. "Mr. Sullivan found evidence of her past machinations," I confessed. "I didn't tell you before because I thought it would be too painful." But my father didn't even look surprised. "I started doing my own investigation after that day with the investors," he admitted, shaking his head. "I got in touch with some of her ex-husbands." I heard a lot of cautionary tales. He tried to smile, but there was too much bitterness in that smile. It turns out that I'm not the first man who fell for her trick. We sat in silence, listening to the lake lapping at the shore, the wind playing in the treetops, and the coming evening bringing peace. What now? I finally asked. My father looked around. His gaze lingered on the floor of the renovated kitchen, on the old beams that he had reinforced himself, on the wooden shutters that we had recently painted, restoring the house to its former appearance. Now we're moving on, he said simply. Rebuild. House. And everything else. That evening, as the sun slowly set behind the lake, coloring the water in shades of gold and copper, we sat on the newly renovated pier, sipping Grandma's favorite lemonade. Around us, the garden was coming back to life. New shoots were sprouting from the loosened earth. Hydrangeas were beginning to bloom, lavender filled the air with a tart aroma, and where Victoria's contractors had uprooted the bushes, a young green shoot was already spreading, as if nature itself had resisted her intervention. The house itself was also changing. The elements artificially imposed by Victoria disappeared, the modern appliances she installed were replaced with more suitable ones, and every little thing restored the house to its true charm, step by step restoring what really mattered here. The father, holding a glass in his hands, looked at the water and finally spoke. One day your grandmother told me something that I didn't understand at the time. I looked at him, knowing he was talking for a reason. She said that houses, like people, have souls. That they remember who loved them and who didn't. I smiled at the familiar wisdom, which made me feel warm and calm inside. She told me the same thing, I said softly. I knew that this was why this place had always seemed special, because generations of our family had filled it with love, care, memory, and things that could not be measured in money. My father nodded, looking at the shore, at the gardens that had begun to bloom again, at the old boathouse that had sheltered our canoes and kayaks for decades, at the house itself, which was slowly but surely returning to its true essence. I forgot about that, he confessed, as if speaking not so much to me as to himself. I got carried away by Victoria's vision. Potential. Profit. Opportunities. He chuckled weakly, shaking his head. I stopped seeing the soul of this place. I looked at him, saw the sincerity in his words, the sincerity he hadn't allowed himself before, and said, not with a question, but with a statement. But now you see her again. He nodded slowly. Yes, I see. He looked around the house, the lake, the garden. And I'm grateful that you fought to protect him. Even when it meant fighting me. I wanted to say something, but at that moment we were interrupted by the sound of a car approaching the house. We turned around, watching Mr. Sullivan get out of the car. His steps were light, and he was holding a thin folder with documents in his hands. Good news, he called, coming closer. My father and I stood up to meet each other, and at that moment I felt something that could not be expressed in words, but that was felt by every cell of my body. Victoria has officially withdrawn all claims to the property, Mr. Sullivan announced. The trust remains indisputable. I nodded, but to my surprise, I realized that I was only half listening to him, because I wasn't looking at the documents, but at my father. I could see how the tension that had been living in his shoulders all this time was finally disappearing, how he looked like the man I remember from childhood, the one who taught me how to fish on the old pier, who helped build sand castles on the shore, who told stories by the fireplace. The lake house was safe. But Grandma protected more than just the house. With her foresight, she has created something more. An opportunity for healing. For the truth. For reconciliation. In the struggle for her legacy, I suddenly found something that I thought I had lost forever. My father.